My name is Steve Westgarth, and this is The Engineering Leader. Today on The Engineering Leader, I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Merrett. Rob is Managing Director at Credera, a company specialising in supporting clients to build out their cloud infrastructure. In previous roles, Rob has also worked with central government, retail, energy and utilities. Rob, thank you so much for joining The Engineering Leader today. Let me tell you a secret. You also write bad code. If you disagree, you may as well switch off. If you're enjoying listening to The Engineering Leader, please take a moment to share a link to the podcast on LinkedIn or Twitter. Bringing together people from a diverse range of backgrounds helps to ensure that we have the knowledge and skills available to solve truly global problems. So let's start by talking about your role at Credera. What's your vision, what do you do, and what you're trying to achieve?
So my role at Credera is mostly helping our clients get the best out of technology, whether that's helping them recover from gnarly ransomware attacks or implementing new software. I guess the way that we like to think about it is that we're their partner in making sure that that happens in the most effective way, where they get the most benefit possible. I'd say that's kind of my vision in a nutshell of what I try to do in my role.
So does that mean you tend to look mainly at infrastructure, or do you get involved with software development, or kind of, where do you really partner best with clients?
So we do everything from front end, let's say app dev, data, and infrastructure. My forte is mostly infrastructure with a bit of app, and occasionally I like to dabble in data. But yeah, as a company, we work across the full stack. But my specialism is very much infrastructure.
And I guess that's a really interesting thing to kind of dig into, because I think in recent years in particular, we start talking around DevOps kind of being really kind of front and center of mind, and bringing operations and dev much closer together. And by virtue of doing that, that naturally means that developers and engineers get much closer to infrastructure build and understanding kind of, how we're going to make sure that systems are alive and performant, and that we haven't got issues if, maybe there's a data center issue which causes a data center to be taken offline, that there's appropriate failover strategies and, and all of those sorts of things. How do you find in your world companies are kind of embracing that DevOps culture, and is that helping you, do you think?
So I think if you adopt the multidisciplinary team aspect of what DevOps and Agile tries to evangelize on, where a team has got the right combination of skills such that team is as effective as possible, then yes. I think where I've seen a lot of folks struggle is where they see that they have an apps DevOps team and an infrastructure DevOps team, and never do the two meet until they try and release it into live, and it all goes horribly wrong because the infrastructure guys didn't have the full appreciation of how the app works, and the app guys didn't have the full appreciation of how the infrastructure works. So I think trying to bridge that gap as much as possible, bringing the two domains of expertise as close to as possible together. I think that's where you see organizations really succeeding in bridging that gap, I'd say.
So I listened to a really angry podcast a few days ago, and there was a lovely, really intelligent guy actually who had a lot of views on kind of DevOps and kind of, he was making the point that DevOps isn't a job. It's a way of being, a way of thinking. And I guess you're supporting that there by saying actually it's about bringing people together in the right way. But it seems to be something that a lot of organizations don't always get right. I don't know what your experience is about. You've worked in a lot of corporate organizations, and we see a lot of DevOps teams kind of appearing all over the place. And I guess that's a problem really for the industry as a whole.
I think so. I'm going to say to a certain extent. I'd like to think that there is definitely a role in the same way that we have agile coaches. Yeah, so someone that can evangelize on what's the best way of adopting this way of thinking, making sure that the teams are aligned to that way of thinking and ways of working. And I think there is something around DevOps engineering. So, not just the ways of working, but also the technical, how do you do it? How do you become most effective in the organization that you're working in? And that won't be the same for every organization. The way the financial services may be able to implement DevOps with a heavy regulatory stance is going to be very different to perhaps, say, a retailer that's perhaps got a bit more risk appetite, let's say. So I think it varies industry by industry, and say some organizations just need more help than others.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that, and I think that, I mean, again, we've worked in similar organisations, we've worked in different organisations, and I guess one of the commonalities that I've found in pretty much every organisation that I find is that they're looking for people to show them best practice, to show the organisation how to do it. And one of the challenges with what you've just said is actually we need to do this on an organisation by organisation basis. So how as an industry can we advise organisations how to implement a DevOps culture if fundamentally we don't really all agree on what a DevOps culture is?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think there's the tenets of DevOps and Agile are fairly well defined. I think, like any methodology or framework, it will come down to how you're going to implement it in a way that's right for your organization. And there's so many different facets to that. Like, what's the skill maturity of the organization? Are they all really well up to date or up to skilled engineers? Is there a learning path that they've got to go on? And that's what I think varies organization by organization. If you just go with the same templated form of this is how I roll out DevOps, and don't take into account the distinct differences of that organization, then you're going to fail at different hurdles. As we said, if you have an organization that has really mature engineers, but let's say less mature processes, then you're going to get hit on a process front rather than a person front. It's that age-old triage, right? Or triad, should I say, of people, process, and technology, and how do you align the three parts of that triangle to implementing DevOps? Is my view, I think.
And that very much cuts to the heart of a point you made a couple of seconds ago about that cross-functional team and bringing people together, so that we can actually combine those skills in order to get an outcome. And I think actually fundamentally for me, this is in any organisation about getting people to effectively work together in order to deliver an outcome, and kind of centralising around what that business goal is and what we're trying to achieve.
100%, yeah.
And I guess you've got a lot of skills and experience in technology change and technology transformation, and I guess one of the things that I've seen in organisations is that we kind of embark on change programs or change initiatives, and we haven't always necessarily got a clear goal in terms of what that's going to open up for the organisation and kind of what we're going to try to achieve. Just wonder if you've got any thoughts on what do organisations tend to get wrong in that change space? Maybe in addition to what I'm talking about there.
So I think the point that you raised around being clear on what the goal is, and importantly, how do you quantify it, and being really clear about how you quantify it as well. I had a really interesting debate when there was an objective around moving to cloud. And they said, we need to get 70% of our infrastructure into cloud. And that's, 70% of what is it? Is it tin? Is it the apps? Have you taken into account things like what you're going to demise? So I think it's being as crystal clear as possible about what you're trying to achieve. And then the other piece to it is, when you're doing technology change, it's very easy to get lost in the technology elements of that technology change. Because I always come back to the people, process, and technology. So how are your people going to adopt this change? What does the impact actually mean to the business? And the processes piece is, if you go to the effort of making a modern app that's very slick and very easy to operate, but then wrap that in slightly more legacy technology change processes, you kind of defeated the point of what you're trying to do in the first place, which is make the organization either more agile or more nimble to change. So I think making sure that, again, you've got that three triangle piece of people, process, and technology nailed in terms of what your program's trying to deliver is really important.
I think that the process element of that you talk about is really interesting, because I think We've both worked in organisations that have come from a history of being very heavily waterfall.
Yep.
They've tried to plan everything up front, maybe centering around a 3-year plan, and then tried to make sure they know all the requirements, all the unknowns, the start of a program, and then then go through the development phase and the testing phase and finally the implementation phase. And I think we know those programs tend to take long, especially if you're talking about multi-million-pound transformation programs. It takes a long time to deliver any value, but also when you actually deliver that value, quite often you find that the value that actually gets delivered isn't what is now needed by the organisation, because the organisation's moved on in some way, or doesn't maybe need something slightly different, or maybe we implement something and then observe how a customer's using it and decide actually we needed something slightly different to that. But actually changing those organisational processes to operate differently is a huge undertaking, which is very, very difficult to do. I guess you've seen that in a number of different organisations, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, for me, it comes down to the context of the organisation and what are the guardrails, I guess, of your transformation. Like, say, if you're working in a financial services organisation, or almost any organisation, actually, negating your responsibility on legal and regulatory requirements is obviously a no-no. So that's got to be baked in relatively early on. But for example, if you're doing like an MVP to test out a hypothesis, do you need to have all of your NFRs that you normally have on a production-like system? No, but you do need to have a way of governing the system in such a way, and the backlog, that those things do get taken into account as the system matures. And I think that's what I see a few organizations struggling with is, I guess, that continuous architecture and continuous governance perspective of if you're going to start out doing an MVP, what are the things that you can not to necessarily put into that MVP, and what are the absolute must-haves? And equally, who's accountable for making that decision? I think accountability is another thing that sometimes organizations can struggle with, is who's the actual person that can say, yeah, okay, we're not going to do that because it's not right to do that at this point.
And I guess a lot of those decisions, some of those technology decisions you're taking, yes, it might be because you're going towards an MVP, so maybe you're going to take some shortcuts or do something in a non-optimal way because you want to get something out to customers and you want to test and learn kind of what customers kind of think. But actually, some of those decisions will back you into a corner where it's really difficult to come back from those decisions 6 months down the line, unless you're going to completely re-architect the app and kind of move that forward. So you're playing devil's advocate a little bit to what you just said. Are you saying that if we're going to launch an MVP, we should be prepared to write it off and totally start again from scratch? And is that the right approach?
So I think this is how you manage technical debt decisions. I think having a good process for identifying technical debt, so where are you taking that shortcut that may trip you up later in the program's life, and how that gets governed through the organization. So, if you've spent 4 weeks writing an MVP because you want to test it with a small set of customers, and the technical debt that you put in means that you have to start from scratch, depending on the size of the organization, that may be acceptable. Equally, it may not be, depending on how much money they've invested in it. I'd say it's that cost-benefit analysis that you need to be really strong on. And equally, if you're taking, let's say, a slightly smaller bite into technical debt, like I say, how does that get managed in the backlog? Because something that you do as a small thing now can snowball over the period of the project and suddenly become this horrible thing that's just grown arms and legs. So that's where I say, I think if you're going to embark on this, let's say, agile development with an MVP mindset, having that technical debt governance is really important.
And once you've kind of got through that MVP stage, maybe you're iterating against a roadmap. You've got a product that's out there in the wild. It's actually delivering value for customers. How do you continue to govern decisions in a way to make sure that the organisation is still being strategic about some of those choices that are being made?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I think that comes down a lot to organizational design and who's accountable for that product once it's gone live. So the product owner, I think, plays a really important role in that, in defining what the roadmap for their product is and what the decisions that they're wanting to make. And then alongside that will be how the split between new functionality versus maintenance versus resolving technical debt is managed. And if you have a product manager that can do that really well and manage those relationships well enough with the business so that they understand, well, in this sprint, we're going to take a compromise on new functionality so that we can remediate some of our technical debt or do some maintenance or do some patching, then I think that becomes you end up seeing quite a lot of success there. I think where you start to see it fail is where so much new functionality gets put on top of this, what was just envisioned to be an MVP, and they've not had the chance to make it more robust, meet all of the NFRs. And because of that, it actually becomes more brittle, more fragile, and harder to change. And so you just end up going back down the monolith route that you were trying to get away from.
And one of the challenges in that space, when you've got a product owner who has a business case to deliver against, or is trying to deliver value for customers, and you're going up against maybe you've got some technical debt to remediate, or you've got some security vulnerabilities that kind of come out, or maybe there's a legal or compliance issue that's kind of been identified. It's sometimes really difficult to demonstrate the value that some of those technical items have. That don't necessarily go towards a growth business case. That might be you're driving your business into the organization. So how do we reconcile that? What can we do as tech professionals to help product owners to understand some of those important technical enablers that need to be kept on top of in order to look after the house?
It's a really great question. So I think it's about how you articulate the value. So complying with legal and regulatory requirements. Let's say you're working with personal data. The articulation there is that if you're caught under the GDPR Act, it's 4% of global turnover. You could view that as, if we remediate it, that's a cost that we may not incur, as long as we put the right controls in and we have the right processes to manage that, right? So I think when you're dealing with an organization that's on a growth journey, it's about how do you not just let's say increase customers or revenue, but also how do you avoid having to pay out for let's say breaches or risks. And the same thing applies for maintenance, right? If you don't maintain your system, you don't patch it, you get hit by a security vulnerability. The cost of remediating that security vulnerability is going to far outweigh what it probably would have cost to remediate it in the first place.
And whilst that's very true, I guess that quantifying that risk is often quite difficult because, especially if you're in a large organisation, that turns over many billions of pounds, of course, your 4% of global turnover is an astronomical number, but you'll get a pushback from a product owner from the business going, but what's the likelihood of that really being the case? What's the likelihood of that happening? And I guess it's quite difficult to kind of, when you talk about numbers which are so big, it's quite difficult to even rationalize what the numbers are, never mind what the chances are of that actually being an issue caused by your app or your product that you're putting into production.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about an organization that's got many billions of pounds, it becomes a lot easier to quantify it because by the very nature you're a well-known brand. That makes you much more of a target. If you're doing something innovative, you're going to want to shout about it. That's going to put you more out on the market even more. People are going to want have much more of bad actors will have much more of a vested interest in potentially finding any exploits with the thing that you release. So I think it's becoming easier to quantify it. And I guess that also comes back to my point about accountability, is having the person that is going to accept that risk. That's always the really tricky conversation. If you're really saying you don't want to remediate this issue that may cause a GDPR breach, who's really going to accept that risk and say, yeah, I'm signing on the dotted line?
Yeah, I think you're right. Who is the decision maker in that scenario? And you're right. I'm sure there's lots of people saying that you shouldn't remediate it, or don't bother with it because of various reasons. But actually, isn't their neck that's really on the line when there is an issue like that, or a breach that that really comes and bites the organisation? And I guess it's actually really surprising how many breaches there are, and how many issues we have with bad actors. And I think it's only really in recent years that maybe that's been so much in the public eye. But I mean, if you look over the last even 24 or 36 months, I mean, the amount of times that that issues are in the news where company X has had a data breach, or there's been a technical issue with company Y, it's actually becoming much more prevalent than it ever was. Do you think that's going to continue to accelerate and become a bigger issue for organisations?
I think it will be, yeah, and I think it puts much more of a focus on kind of those NFRs that we were talking about just now, especially from the security perspective. It was a really interesting stat by Microsoft in one of their reports, which it's along the lines of the top 11 simplest things to implement from an information security perspective would protect you against 98% of vulnerabilities or potential exploits. So it's amazing how much I want to say the simpler aspects of information security can protect organizations. But in terms of your question, do I think it's only going to get worse? I think it will, because as quickly as we can remediate issues, we're also finding new issues. So yeah, I think that's just going to continue.
And thinking as an engineer, I mean, how much personal responsibility should individual engineers bear for that? And the reason I ask the question is that in my engineering teams, we're obviously very dependent upon engineers doing the right thing and surfacing the right problems. But so much of what an engineer does is written in code. It's behind the scenes. It's not presented as part of a show and tell. Product owners wouldn't necessarily know the quality of the code and kind of what's being built out. And we obviously have good practices around. We do code reviews, and we make sure we're pair programming, and we've got various things in our pipelines that look for code smells and look for security vulnerabilities. But still, it ultimately comes down to what an engineer is doing on the ground to make sure that organizations are protected from these issues. And that's quite scary when you think an individual is potentially responsible for such big consequences.
Yeah, it's quite scary, I guess, as an individual, that you can ultimately be, I guess, responsible for a breach of some kind through your work. I think, certainly the way that I think about it is, how would I feel if it was my data that was compromised? Whether that be personal data or otherwise. And I guess that's where you start to think, well, okay, what are the things that I need to do as an individual that can potentially stop this from happening? If it was my company and I was spending my money, what would I want to do to make sure that I protect the reputation of the company, for example? And I think one of the things that's quite interesting as well is that we're starting to see I want to say the responsibility on an engineer change from just doing code to understanding, like you say, the more security aspects of how a developer can do secure code, and the advent of DevSecops, so that they get that real-time feedback on how are they doing, what's the vulnerabilities in their code or their application that they're building, or indeed their infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's going to be really interesting, and in a few weeks' time, we've got Dario and Calza, who's going to come and talk to me on the engineering on the engineering leader, all around Devsecops, and essentially how you can move some of those decisions, further to the left. So we actually bring security into our development flow, as part of the course for everyday development cycle, and I guess that applies not just to DevSecOps. I mean, it applies to operations. It applies to running the app in production. It applies to performance issues. The further right in the development flow that you can actually see issues, the better it is for everybody. And that's not even necessarily an agile practice. I mean, that's just got to be good common sense. Let's see issues early, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great point, I guess, to talk about kind of observability and telemetry. Like you say, just doing it from the code perspective is one thing, but then having the monitoring once the application has gone live to look for those kind of scary things where your application is maybe under attack, or someone's trying to do something with the application that they shouldn't be. And that's where it leads into your point about, well, how do we make sure that ops are involved in that as well? And I think observability and telemetry is really key to that.
And one of the things we're really moving towards with my engineering teams is the concept of it, build it, own it mentality. So a lot of organizations have traditionally operated, I guess, with an ITIL model by which you separate development and operations. So developers develop, and then we throw it over the fence and it goes into some sort of service organization who run it into production. And I guess that there are a lot of challenges with that. I mean, one, obviously, the service folks don't know the application as well as the people who've actually built it. They haven't got the right knowledge, haven't necessarily got the right skills to fix it and to do all of those things. And by moving towards a build and own it model, it moves the idea of monitoring and the idea of alerting and looking after the app in production very firmly into the development cycle. And that means, if the app's in production and there's an issue in the middle of the night, it's the developers who wrote the app that's going to get woken up to have to go and fix it. And hopefully that promotes the right behaviors in terms of making sure that we have really fixed it, and the issue won't occur again, because obviously no one wants to get woken up. From a risk management point of view, though, people may argue, it's more risky to operate in that way because you're giving developers access to production data, or to systems that maybe in a traditional ITIL model you wouldn't have given access to. What's your view on that?
Oh, that's a really hard one. I think that's going to depend a lot on. I'm going to start with trust. Can you trust the developers in a production environment to, I guess, respect the boundaries between a live operational system and a development system? In a development system, a dev quite rightly would be able to go into a database file or table and do a select star on the data to understand is there a data corruption problem. It's obviously a very different story in a live environment where perhaps you've got personally identifiable information. Is the developer could go through the right process to make sure there's an audit trail of why they've gone to that table, search for that data. I think so. Trust is one part of it, and I guess supporting that then is also the auditability of that system. That's kind of my observability element. Has the production system got all of the right metrics to know when someone's kind of stepping out of line? And then I would then lean into the process bit, which is if someone does step out of line, have you got the way of identifying it and then doing something about it? That's probably where I'd go with that, because it is a very difficult one. And I would say I came from an ops background, and the worlds are quite different, I think. And I think there's got to be a mutual respect of both developers and operations. The two very different worlds. And there's got to be a respect of both skill sets, I think.
And I guess that is it's fundamentally DevOps, right? I mean, what we're trying to do here is to bring the two skill sets really close together to create that cross-functional team. And I think you're right. I mean, that element about trust and trusting your development teams is really important. But to go with that, you have to make sure that the appropriate controls, training, support is placed around that. And also, as you say, there are some skill sets within that you still need. You still need operations professionals who are going to monitor and make sure that the right alerting is in place and all of those things. I guess for me, it's about getting engineers more involved in that conversation and removing the fence. So we might be playing in different gardens, but let's at least be able to see each other and talk to each other without having to do it through some big barrier. So actually bringing the organisations closer together is incredibly important for me. So let's change the conversation a little bit. So I guess you're very focused on cloud, and particularly Azure cloud. You're definitely a Microsoft man, I think would be a fair statement.
Yeah, I've definitely got my Microsoft badges over the years.
So what is it about Microsoft and in particular Azure that you like?
So I guess Microsoft, it was one of those brands that I grew up with from quite a young age. So it's just been, I guess, always there. I started messing about with computers probably when I was about 13 years old, and carried on since then. It's always been Microsoft. For me, it's just been a technology that I found quite easy to adopt, but also the community that comes with Microsoft as well. I would say for me, the community is really strong, but both commercially, but also as just an end user. And then more recently, I guess the innovations that Microsoft have been coming out with, like the submerging of data centers in oceans, to look at the impact that has on not just how long we can make servers and computers last, but also the effect that actually has on the marine life. I found that fascinating. So yeah, I guess that's kind of why I aligned to Microsoft, and then subsequently Azure. So I guess the cloud thing for me, cloud thing, that sounds terrible. Yeah, I came from an organization where it was predominantly data centers, and they were just starting to dabble with VMware. And then when I came to Credera, they were very focused on how do we build cloud capability. And there wasn't really that many folk that were doing Azure at the time. So it also felt like quite a nice fit for me to skill up and I guess become the Azure guy.
So one of the things that I still think people don't really understand about the cloud, whenever we talk about the cloud, you will see people literally pointing up and pointing at the sky because that's where the cloud is. But in essence, we're still talking about data centers. I mean, you referenced some of the innovations there that Microsoft have done by submerging servers and submerging data centers at the bottom of the ocean. Ultimately, we still have data in data centers. The cloud is just essentially putting our trust into large organizations who have the financial backing, the capital, the technical expertise to manage those data centers, arguably better than individual companies can do on their own. So, given that, I mean, did you agree with that? Is the cloud actually the right approach? Are we right to centralize all of our services into the hands of what is becoming, I guess, an ever decreasing number of significantly large corporations that now control the vast majority of the world's data?
So it's a very interesting and difficult problem. I guess the flip side of it is pre-cloud. It was a number of system integrators. So perhaps the pool has got smaller, and you've now predominantly got the big three cloud providers with most of it. But I guess it's just been an evolution of the model that we had before. I think is the cloud just another data center? I don't think so. For me, it's really fundamentally different. Like you say, I want to say the democratization, if that's the word, of the accessibility to that technology and the ease upon which people can learn and use that technology is what the fundamental mind shift or mindset change has been. You can, I guess before cloud, you could be a specialist in checkpoint firewalls, for example, and maybe pick up other firewalls. But then that would somewhat limit the next organization that you went to. Ideally, you'd want to go to another organization that also did checkpoint firewalls. I think now, because all of that has been I guess, managed to a degree by Microsoft, your scope of your next role is, well, yeah, do you use Azure? And yeah, taking that a step further, I'm not going to say it's easy to transition between the cloud providers. There's definitely an upskill that one has to do. But I guess the concepts remain very similar. So I guess it's I want to say democratizing access to that knowledge, that skill set, in a way that we've not been able to before as well.
I guess one of the things that really blows my mind about, as we've kind of moved to the cloud and, we've adopted this approach, is the accessibility of the technology. If you imagine, a few years ago, even 10 years ago, somebody creates an app in their bedroom, a student, and, starts to get downloads of that app on whatever platform he's kind of launched it on, it would have been very difficult for him to scale up and to have actually to support your volume of users, and that would have very quickly become very costly. Where suddenly we're now in a world where your student who's working in his bedroom, if he needs to have all of the computing power in the world to support his application, suddenly he has access to it in a few clicks, via a cloud provider of choice. And yes, that costs, but actually his costs then proportionately ramp up, provided that's managed correctly in line with the growth of his app and what's happening in that space. That access and ability to be able to do that sort of that sort of project, traditionally would have been in the gift of your large corporate organization that had the financial backing, whereas now this is open to everybody who wants to innovate.
Yeah, 100%. Like you say, as long as those costs get managed very, very carefully, because I think as a student, some of the cloud costs that I've seen, that they might have been a bit difficult to swallow if you ramped up too quickly.
Yeah, it is true. I think it is very easy. You are right to get your cost management in the cloud wrong, and I think it would also be fair to say that within all of the cloud providers, it's not necessarily, you aren't always necessarily supported in the best way to make sure it's as cheap as it possibly could be. And maybe that's something that we as an industry need to learn from, to make sure that actually we're doing the ethical thing in that space, right?
Yeah, 100%.
But you've mentioned multi-cloud, and obviously I know you're very into Azure and Microsoft. Is multi-cloud important to us as we move forward?
I know I've used this term a lot in the time that we've been speaking, but I'm going to go with my answer of it. I think it depends entirely on your organization and what you want to get out of multi-cloud. Yeah, I'm going to come back to financial services again. We know that from a regulatory perspective, they're being encouraged to not put all their eggs in one basket. And in fact, that could be valid for any number of enterprise customers that don't want to be put into a corner. I think the main thing when you're considering multi-cloud is, what exactly are you going to use each cloud for? Because where it gets very expensive, very difficult to manage, is where you just, I want to say, striping all of your applications across all of your cloud providers. Because there's one or two ways of them managing that. One, which is you, when I say independently, find the people that know Azure and AWS and build up the capability individually. Or you look at or what they call the applications like Pivotal and such, which let's say orchestrate across multiple cloud providers. And I guess that becomes somewhat difficult in the sense that in reality what you end up going with is the lowest common denominator with one of those applications, because that you won't be able to get the power of AWS or Azure or GCP if you're using something which can only interface in a consistent way across all three.
Cool. And obviously, multi-cloud is one of these things, but from a strategic perspective, what should organizations really be thinking about when developing their cloud strategy? What do you think should be really front and center of mind?
I think it's again, depending on what the organization is trying to achieve by adopting cloud. Is it agility? Is it cost saving? And making sure that when you're developing your cloud strategy, you're delivering on what that objective is. If it's cost saving, as we all know, doing a pure lift and shift of 20-year-old monolithic applications, that's not going to save you a whole bunch of money. It's probably going to cost you more money in the long run. So if you are doing that, making sure that you've planned to invest to modernize once you've done perhaps that tactical lift and shift. And there are perfectly valid cases for doing that. If you're trying to exit a data center, it may be that the quickest stopgap is move it all up to cloud very quick and then modernize later. But you've really got to have that modernize later as a part of your business case, and also really understanding that total cost of ownership. So I think when you're developing your cloud strategy, it's going to come back to what you're trying to using, or what are you wanting to use the cloud for, and what benefits are you trying to drive out of it.
And I guess that links us to to another point. I mean, we often talk about the cloud as if it's one technology. We refer to Azure as if Azure is the cloud, but actually, the cloud is built up of a whole ruck of technologies that are embedded within it. And actually, saying somebody is an Azure expert doesn't necessarily mean that they've got skills and experience in every technology that you can leverage within the Azure cloud. So, I mean, let's dig a little bit deeper than just talking about Azure or AWS. Let's talk about your technologies that we can currently leverage in the cloud. I mean, you're working in that space every day. What technology are you currently most excited about?
So for me, I think it's going to be the data capabilities. I mean, cloud has been on this phenomenal journey of democratizing infrastructure, making that easier to work with. That kind of then went into application hosting, and I think now that they're really starting to focus in on data. So if I go back perhaps 5 years in my career, where clients were having to talk about investing a significant amount of money in these Hadoop platforms so that they could do machine learning and such. So that's now almost a thing of the past, because it's all on hand. As long as you can find some way of getting your data into the cloud so that you can run machine learning models, or in the case of Azure, the cognitive services that they have, you can do that almost on demand with vast libraries of this stuff that would normally take, or would have previously taken folk hours to code. And I think that's where you start, or we're starting to see that in a very similar way to DevOps, that shift about folk having to worry about infrastructure to folk actually getting value out of the tools and technologies that they're using. So that's where I get quite excited.
And you mentioned there machine learning, artificial intelligence, and clearly that's where you're right at the cutting edge of where businesses are and what can be done. Are we really ready for that sort of technology? Are businesses really ready to adopt that, do you think? Because many businesses I've worked with, they're still trying to get the fundamentals right, of trying to understand how to have a performant website, a performant app, that's able to deliver customer value. Machine learning seems a big distance away from some of those conversations, but maybe not.
I think the challenge always is, how do you bring that insight, I want to say, that you've developed back into the operational processes. So if you've, let's say you've developed some process mining to look at how effective are the processes that I have in the organization. It's very, very good to identify where those processes are stalled, but if you're not using that to modernize the processes, make them faster, then it's I want to say you've only solved half of the problem. And so I think the real gap that folk are facing is how do you operationalize that insight that you've derived? How do you bring it into the business and embed it into the processes? But I do think organizations are ready for it.
And I mean, with that in mind, talk to me a little bit about technology adoption. So if you're thinking about, you're working with a business, you're thinking about what technology might be suitable to really kind of accelerate them or take them to the next level, what process do you personally go through working out if a technology is fit for purpose and if a business is really ready to embrace it?
So for me, I start with what are you trying to achieve? Always, like, So you want to implement new technology. Why? What is it that you're trying to do? Because sometimes technology isn't always the right answer. Yeah, I worked in one project where the cost of integrating into a legacy system was literally going to be millions. And so a question is, well, is it better to have humans do that process rather than technology if it's going to cost you so much to do it? Or is there process efficiencies that you can find in doing that process, for example? So I always start with the why. And then if you've got a good reason for using the technology, it's got to start from how do you embed that technology into the business? So what is going to be the people adoption of it? How are you going to skill people up to use it? How are you going to bring that technology into your business processes? Should your business processes change as a result of having that technology? And that's always a really interesting one when you're going from a world where perhaps you had a very paper-based process to, let's say, a case management system, for example, that automates a lot of that. So it's a big mindset change. And then I guess once you've got the technology in, because you never release a tool where you've got all of the benefit of the tool on day one. So for me, it comes to that kind of product owner mindset of how do you continue to leverage the tool or technology to the best of its capability and get the full benefit out of it. And it's that continual process of, we're going to release this feature and then that feature aligned with, the upskilling of the people that use the tool to take advantage of it. So that's, I guess, a bit of the way that I think about it.
It's interesting you say that, is technology always the right answer? And I remember a program that I worked on a few years ago where, if you go to an engineering team will always say, I'll build you something, I'll build you a system, I'll make something happen. And we went through this process of kind of understanding, how long it was going to take to implement a particular feature, on this system that we were doing for a client. And actually, after we'd done that, we costed it up. It was going to take something like 4 or 5 sprints to do this bit of work or whatever. But then we asked her what turned out to be the best question we'd ever asked. We were talking about, well, how often is this feature going to be used? And somebody said, well, actually, it's going to be used maybe once every 6 to 8 months. By somebody who have to do this particular process. And when we dug into how long it would actually take to do the manual process, maybe work out maybe 20 minutes of an individual's time. So you're then finding yourself, you're comparing the value of you're implementing this technology feature that's going to, yes, make it all automated so you can press a button, but actually, is it really such a hardship that once every 6 to 8 months, someone's going to spend 20 minutes doing something manual? So sometimes really looking at that value conversation and understanding what we're trying to deliver for the business and why we're doing that is really important. And often I find, as an engineer, that we can sometimes lose sight of that bigger picture of what we're trying to unlock and what we're trying to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said earlier, for me, it always comes back to that articulation of value. What's the value that you're going to get out of doing this?
And you've touched a little bit on legacy systems there, and I guess this is a problem that's faced by a lot of organisations. We're often hamstrung by legacy systems that have been implemented and they've been there for many, many years. They're doing a job. Are we going to take them to the cloud with us? Are we better to actually just leave them in the data centre where they are? Do we need to modernise them? How do you think organisations should approach that challenge of legacy that virtually every organisation has?
So there's obviously different approaches that you can take. I guess from a cloud migration perspective, you've got the typical lift and shift, rehost, refactor, re-architect, reimagine type things, right? I think. And there's obviously different architecture patterns that you can apply to this as well. The likes of Strangulation, where you slowly strangle the capability off of the legacy system onto a new system. So my advice to any organization would always be, well, what is it you're trying to achieve with the legacy system? Is it that the benefit that it delivers is invaluable to the organization, but it just needs to be done in a more modern way? Or is it that eventually you need to demise the system altogether? Because that's going to very much affect how much money are you willing to invest into this this thing, right? So I'd say have the grown-up conversation about what you're trying to do with the system, and what's the vision for this system, and then apply architecture patterns like either Strangler Fig to slowly eke off the capability and move it to a new system, or apply, let's say, more, I guess, basic approaches like lift and shift, if you eventually plan to demise it.
And you mentioned there, for example, the strangler pattern, and I think in my experience, one of the challenges that you often find within organizations is when you adopt a strategy like strangulation, it's actually keeping the organization focused on the agreement that you were strangulating, because in that space, it will typically take a much longer period to strangulate something than it would to just go all out and rewrite it again from scratch. Have you seen effective results by strangulating systems? Have you ever got to the end of a strangulation that has seen the effective removal of a system?
Yes, I have, and I think your point around focus is really valid. You got to maintain the focus that the case that you've got is about decommissioning the system, in theory, and realizing the benefits of that. And that doesn't mean that you can only do half the job and then walk away from it, because you're still going to be left with the legacy system at the end of it. So your point around focus is 100% correct. I think the other point is around where I've seen strangulation not work so well is I guess there's two ways that you can think about it. One, which is I'm going to take the application kind of tier by tier. So I'll move the front end, then I'll move the application services, then I'll move the data over. Or you can think about it in very thin slices where you talk about capability. So it's kind of like top-down capability. Let's say user journeys. You move over a user journey from one place to another. And I think where I see the most success is where people really think about the user journey, because that really helps articulate that, I'm going to say, the people, process, and technology angle, but from the application perspective. So how do the users interact with the system or the user journey? Who are all the different stakeholders that are involved? I think you get much better articulation that way than perhaps if you try and apply more of a, I want to say, technical view of how to strangulate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, and I think you're right in that space. I mean, it's making sure that we have a consistent focus on what the user actually needs and what the user is going to experience. I know, so in my previous role at Boots, we were strangulating our e-commerce platform, and we found it very challenging to move to a world by which the user could seamlessly move between monolith and cloud native application. And we had a lot of conversations around some really technical things around session management and making sure that authentication works seamlessly and making sure that that the user got the experience that they wanted throughout the whole of that process. And I think in hindsight, although it was absolutely the right decision for Boots to strangulate their monolith, I think that it would have been easier if we'd taken an alternative approach and perhaps just rebuilt the website from scratch. But it's very difficult to make the business case to do some of those things, as we found. So I guess you're constantly trading off what you're trying to achieve versus what the business needs, what the customer needs, what the business case is, and that often causes a lot of challenges. Yeah,
definitely, and I guess baked into that is the different viewpoints of your stakeholders as well. That's always a very challenging one, and being able to balance those different viewpoints.
And I guess that brings us to this idea of vision versus results, because actually in a large corporate organization you will have many visions that may be differing across different stakeholder groups, and you're constantly trying to come back to the key results. What are we actually trying to achieve as a result of doing that? What's your perspective on that disconnect?
I I think my perspective is going to be having someone that is ultimately accountable for what you're doing. When I say ultimately accountable, I don't just mean from like a functionality perspective, but overall accountable to the business. The person that fully appreciates that conflict of, like we were discussing earlier, new functionality versus the non-functional aspects of building the system. And having that single person that is there, can make the decisions, and can help remove impediments is really important. And I guess the important thing for that person is to have, we talk about vision, but what are the tangible things of that vision? What are the things that almost, if you tick all these boxes, I'm going to be super happy with you. And then how do you track them? Because like you say, when you're in the depths of delivery, it's very easy to put your head down and get into it. But I think if you've got something to always refer back to, where you're asking the question, is this really getting me towards that end goal? That's really helpful, I think, for teams, to be able to, I guess, quantify that the work they're doing on a day-to-day basis is edging them closer towards that goal or meeting that vision.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I guess one of the things around your vision is your vision should obviously be owned within the organisation, right? So if you're working within the organisation, you want an owner that is ultimately responsible, probably has some sort of P&L accountability for what's actually happening in that space. You've spent a lot of years working within large consultancies. So, often your organisations will outsource your engineering requirements or whatever it might be to external parties. How have you found yourself able to really align to the vision of the organisation, and how's that worked for you in a consultancy capacity?
So I think where it's gone really well is having the relationship with that person that is ultimately accountable. So you almost so that you can hear firsthand what is it that they're trying to achieve. Because I think, and I imagine developers equally have this frustration sometimes. The more layers you put in between the person that's asking for something and the person on the ground delivering it, the more chance there is for ambiguity or even the slightest change in the context of a sentence can mean huge differences and interpretations of words. That I always think back to that. There was a delivery report on one project that had an end date for a feature of just February 19. And no one had quantified what they mean by February 19. And so the CEO took it to be the 19th of February, whereas the delivery partner took it to be just sometime in February in the year 2019. So it could have been right at the end of February, but as long as it was delivered within February, they consider it done. That clarity for me is really important.
I think you're right. I mean, alignment is hugely important. One of the things that I've found to be really useful and helpful in terms of driving clarity is to use OKRs. And I don't know if you've come across that, but your objective key results.
Yep.
I find is a very good framework to help to really frame that. And one of the best examples I've seen of that is it's the Google example, which you may have come across before. When Google bought YouTube back in 2016, they clarified that actually their most important goal was watch time, and actually their key result was to get 1 billion hours of watch time every week on YouTube. And that clarity of purpose, of saying actually everything we do in the organization, regardless of what it is going to be centered around helping us to drive towards more watch time on YouTube. We want 1 billion hours of watch time. I think is incredibly powerful. And in particular, if you're working with partners, and actually almost more importantly, if you're working within partners, actually having that clarity around what you're trying to achieve is something that's so important for organizations to really strive for. So we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. It's very easy to kind of end up pulling in slightly different directions, or not you're all going towards the same organizational objective or goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the more interesting things is certainly when you're in the position of managing suppliers, um, both being a supplier and having to have manage suppliers. I think being able to reflect that in the way that you contract as well is really powerful. Organizations are moving more and more towards agile, what they term as agile contracting. So that the way that you're contracting your partner is reflective of the benefit that you're trying to get out of them. I think that's a really important thing for organizations to think about. Is how can I make sure that the way that I'm contracting with a partner is reflective of the objective or vision that I'm trying to achieve.
I think something that I've never really seen, but I think you can totally see we need a model for, is a really effective outcome-based contract.
Yes.
And it's something which a lot of partner organisations are talking about right now, and a lot of people are kind of working about, well, how can we formulate words within a contractual arrangement that is about delivering outcome, and that's very clearly different from a contract that is to deliver a thing. We aren't contracting to to implement a system or to build a website or to implement a set of features. Instead, you want to contract to increase revenue or to move the needle in some way in favour of the organisation. And I still don't think I certainly haven't seen it. And I'd be if anybody's listening who has an example of a really good outcome-based contract, I would be really keen to hear about it and to have a look at it. But I think as an industry we haven't quite got there yet. But it's something it's a nut for me that we need to crack, and that's really going to unlock, I think, the next 10, 20, 30 years of consulting, really, and how that needs to work for the consulting industry to really survive and thrive.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the move to outcome-based contracts is a really interesting one, and I'll say also quite a difficult one as well. I think being able to get a supplier and a client on the same page about what the outcome is, that's going to be the challenge, I think.
Definitely. I mean, just thinking again about your experience of working in a consultancy. I mean, people might be listening who are thinking about maybe wanting to go into a career within a consultancy, or seeing it as an opportunity maybe for growth, or maybe somebody's working in an organisation and thinking, hey, they maybe want to jump ship and actually go consulting as opposed to to working for an organisation itself. What's your perspective? What advice could you give to anybody considering consulting as a career choice?
I guess what I'd say is consulting is hugely rewarding. Being able to work with so many diverse clients across multiple different industries. I'd say the core thing, I think, to consulting, if you're looking to make a switch, is going to be those soft skills. How do you I guess well articulate, I'm not doing a very good job of this, evidently, your point to a client. How do you come across well to a client? How do you articulate a really complex problem in a way that a client's going to understand it and appreciate the level of depth that you've put into your solution, for example. So for me, the main thing that I've learned across my years of consulting is going to be keeping up with the soft skills as well as those technical skills, so that you can articulate the complexity of your thinking to folk that aren't necessarily going to be on the same technology wavelength as yourself.
I think there's an awful lot of things in that. I mean, I think that as a tech professional, being able to articulate tech in a way that people understand is incredibly important. And I think there's also something in demonstrating your own understanding of the technology, because if you can take a really complex problem and explain it to somebody who doesn't understand the problem, then that, by virtue of being able to do that, demonstrates you really understand the space. And I think for me, that's the value that the consultancy really can bring. It's about putting people into organisations that have a really in-depth and detailed knowledge of a particular sphere or domain, that they're able to articulate in a clear way and give the business options in terms of where to drive to and how to unlock a particular business problem or area that might be helpful to them.
Yeah, 100%. I think a nice way of doing that for me has always been storytelling. How do you take your client or the organization that you're working with on the journey from being where they are today to where they want to be in the future, and what are the steps that they need to go on to be able to do that?
Yeah, 100%. So I've tended to end our podcast talks with a bit of crystal ball time. I love asking about the crystal ball, asking you to get your crystal ball out and talk to me about the future. So we've talked a lot about the cloud. We've talked around engineering practices. We've talked about challenges that organizations face. If you had a crystal ball and you were looking forward for maybe the next 5 or 10 years, what technology challenges do you think are going to be most relevant to companies, and what should we start thinking about now in order to set organizations up for success in the future?
It's a really good question. I think we're going to see a lot of organizations probably realizing some of the technical debt that they've been carrying for a while. And I think to a certain extent you're seeing that with cloud at the moment. We see some organizations that did the lift and shift kind of 5 years ago and are coming back now, starting to say this is costing an awful lot of money that we didn't necessarily expect in the first place. To which the answer is normally you have to think about modernizing it. See some organizations taking the nuclear option of going back on premise. So I think we're going to see quite a lot of that. I think the focus on what I was alluding to earlier with kind of the people and process changes can become more predominant. In that there's going to be a bigger push, I think, to streamline processes, automate them a lot more as well. So, the traditional, I guess, let's say service onboarding that we'd normally see of an Excel spreadsheet, that being more automated in terms of the CI/CD pipelines and the checks that they can do. And then I guess the more looking further down the line, I'd hope to say that I think that multidisciplinary team concept is going to be far more embedded. And I think that's going to mean a lot less friction in delivery. That's what I'd like to think.
Yeah, I hope you're true with that as well. I mean, I also have a lot of faith in multidisciplinary teams. I think that it certainly for me, I can see the benefits of working that way. I think it opens up a huge amount of opportunities for organizations. So, hopefully your crystal ball's right, but I guess we'll wait and see, eh?
I hope so.
Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me on The Engineering Leader. I'm sure we'll definitely have you back on a podcast at some point in the future. Your insights have been absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
I'd love to. Thank you for having me.
My name is Steve Westgarth, and this is The Engineering Leader. Rob is such an amazing technologist with a brilliant ability to communicate with business stakeholders using clear, non-technical language. He is able to articulate complex technical problems in a really accessible way, which is something many engineers often struggle with. I really enjoyed chatting to him and exchanging views about cloud adoption. I'd be really interested to hear your views. Perhaps your organization is adopting a lift and shift approach, or maybe you are setting up an Azure data lake. Drop me a message on Twitter at Steve Westgarth, or search Steve Westgarth on LinkedIn to let me know what you're up to. Let me tell you a secret. You also write bad code. If you disagree, you may as well switch off.